Okay, welcome back. I think we can get started with the second session of the day. The speaker is Stephie. Sorry, help me out.
Read, but it smells like fried, so anything is fine.
Given the climate change topic, I guess that was the simple of mind. Okay, the macro effects of climate policy uncertainty.
So thanks very much for putting together this conference and for including our paper on the program. So this is joint work with Kevin Noman and Will Peterman, and we have the usual disclaimer that the views in this paper are not necessarily the views of the Fed. So there's no federal climate policy currently in place in the US at the moment. And by that, what I mean is we don't have a nationwide tax on carbon emissions or a national cap and trade system for carbon emissions. But there is widespread awareness that we could introduce a climate policy at some point in the future. So for example, if we just look back over the past decade or so, there have been several serious legislative attempts to get federal action on climate change. So in 2009, the House passed the Waxman-Markey bill, which, if it had also passed in the Senate, would have established a cap and trade system for carbon emissions in the US economy. Or more recently, there was the Clean Power Plan under the Obama administration, and then Biden just a few months ago rejoined the Paris Agreement and released kind of a comprehensive plan to reduce US carbon emissions. So we're going to use this term climate policy risk to refer to the possibility that the US could introduce kind of a national coordinated climate policy at some point in the future. And we think this climate policy risk could have important implications for the macroeconomy because it affects the decision to invest in long-lived capital assets that are used in conjunction with fossil fuel. So for example, consider a firm that wants to invest in a new coal boiler. The return to that coal boiler will be a lot lower if the government introduces a carbon tax in the future than if the government doesn't introduce the tax. So we can think about climate policy risk as kind of creating a downside risk for investment in things like coal boilers. A parallel but opposite reasoning would suggest it creates an upside risk for investment in things like solar panels. And since a large share of the US capital stock, about a fifth by our estimates, is kind of specialized to use fossil fuel, we think this risk, this climate policy risk could have important implications for the macroeconomy. But the approach in most previous work, when we think about evaluating different climate policy options, is to abstract from climate policy risk and assume that we're beginning in a world in which agents believe there is zero chance that the government could introduce a policy in the future. So there's essentially no anticipation of a future climate policy. And so really what we want to do in this paper is both drop that assumption, so say what if agents do anticipate that there's this chance we could introduce climate policy, and also to understand the importance of that assumption for how we evaluate different policy options. So what we do is we develop a dynamic general equilibrium model of climate policy risk for the US economy. And we use the model to look at how climate policy risk affects US emissions, output, consumption, and so on, and what its implications are for evaluating different future climate policies. Throughout, I'm going to use a carbon tax as kind of an example of that future climate policy, but you should really think of that as kind of a stand-in for either a tax, a cap and trade system, or just kind of a coordinated effort to national effort to get action on climate change, even if it's through regulation. And our general approach will be to study an equilibrium in which there's no carbon tax in place, but there's this chance that the government could introduce a carbon tax at some point in the future. So what we find is that this risk of a future climate policy gives you a small reduction in emissions, even though there's not an actual tax in place. And this emissions reduction comes because the climate policy risk shifts the economy towards cleaner capital, and it also reduces the total level of capital stock. So you see emissions being reduced, both just because we're producing less, and then what we are producing, we're producing more cleanly. And this also kind of affects how we think about cost of inaction on climate policy. And there's a sense in which maybe there's this silver lining in that we're reducing emissions a little bit, even though we don't actually have a climate policy in place. But what we'll also show is that this is a very costly way to reduce emissions relative to just using a simple tax. And lastly, we'll look at how climate policy risk matters for how we evaluate the effects of different climate policies. And so if we think about, if you abstract from climate policy risk and assume agents don't anticipate climate policy, then you end up overstating the effects of actually introducing that policy in terms of its impact on emissions reduction, output, consumption, and so on. This paper relates to both the environmental and the macro literature, and particularly on the environmental side, there's some really nice work on policy tipping and stranded assets by Rick and Armand that we're building off of. There's also this literature on the green paradox, which has the opposite implication from what we're finding, and that the green paradox argues that the risk of climate policy in the future is going to increase emissions today instead of decreasing emissions today. And kind of that green paradox argument is hinging on kind of the exhaustibility of fossil fuel. And for the majority of this paper, we're going to assume that scarcity constraints on fossil fuel are not binding. And so we're going to think about fossil fuel as a resource in infinite supply. And so we won't have those green paradox mechanisms. But at the end, what I'll do is I'll come back and we'll revisit our paper in the context of the green paradox, bring in the green paradox mechanism, and run a horse race between the two predictions. So I want to start with a simple model that I can solve analytically, which the goal here is just to highlight the channels through which climate policy risk affects the economy. And so in this simple model, I'm only going to focus on the production side of the economy. So we'll have kind of will be made up of infinitely lived entrepreneurs, and these entrepreneurs are making investment decisions to maximize expected lifetime profits. And these entrepreneurs can invest in two types of capital. First, there'll be a fossil capital. This is capital that either produces fossil fuel directly, so think like an oil rig, or it requires fossil fuel to operate, so something like a coal boiler or an internal combustion engine. And using the detailed data on capital assets from the National Income and Product Accounts, about 1/5 of the US capital stock would fall into this fossil capital category. And the other type of capital we'll have in the simple model is what we'll call clean capital. And this is capital that's designed either to replace fossil capital, so think a solar panel instead of the coal boiler, or to replace fossil fuel. And by that, what I have in mind is improvements in energy efficiency. So if I have better insulation, then I can use less air conditioning and less heating. So I use less fossil fuel and more of this energy efficiency capital. So the production structure is such that there's a unique final good, which is produced from a clean intermediate, that's the XC, and a fossil intermediate, which is XF, and labor, which is just fixed and an exogenous supply. The clean and fossil intermediates are produced, the clean intermediate at least is produced from clean capital, and the fossil intermediate is produced using a Leontief function of fossil capital and fossil fuel. Now, what the Leontief function implies is that there's no substitutability between fossil capital and fossil fuel. If I have a coal boiler, I have to shovel in a certain amount of coal in order to get the to operate the boiler. Now, in the data, the way we substitute away from fossil fuel is either through switching to renewable energy or to investing in energy efficiency. And we've modeled both of those channels as investment in clean capital. And so in the model, you also have to switch away from fossil fuel by making those clean capital investments. Now, again, for the majority of this paper, we're kind of saying, taking the view that the scarcity constraints on fossil fuel are not binding. And so we're saying fossil fuel is going to be produced from units of final good, just at a constant marginal cost, which is zeta. So we're thinking about the US economy as being in this equilibrium in which there's no carbon tax in place, but there's this chance that the government could introduce a carbon tax at some point in the future. So we'll call this a no tax steady state, but with risk. So in this world, with probability 1 minus rho, the government will not introduce the carbon tax and will stay in this steady state where there's no tax, but there's this risk of a future tax.
Steph,
and then with
can I interrupt you for a clarification?
Yeah.
In your model, there is climate policy risk.
Yes.
Is there climate change?
No.
Ah, okay, that's what I thought.
And so probably 1 minus rho, we won't introduce this carbon tax, and we'll stay in this steady state with risk, but with no carbon tax. Then with probability rho, we will introduce a carbon tax, and the economy will begin this kind of dynamic transition to a new long-run equilibrium with the climate policy in place. Now, importantly here, we're modeling the introduction of the carbon tax as an absorbing state. And so all uncertainty is resolved once the carbon tax is introduced, and this transition path and the eventual policy steady state are entirely deterministic. Now, of course, if we think about the real world, there's always this chance that we could introduce a carbon tax and then it could be repealed. So Australia is a prominent example of this, where they had a tax and it was repealed 2 years later. And so what we do in the paper, what we won't go through here, is we look at sensitivity to what happens if the carbon tax is repealed after 1, 2, 4, 8 years, and so on. And in general, we find pretty similar results as to allowing it to just be permanent. So what I do is I solve for this steady state analytically, in which there's no tax, but there's this risk of a future tax. And then we can look at how that risk affects the emissions and in the current economy through its effects on capital. And so this is showing you the ratio of clean to fossil capital. And so what you see here is, for a moment, pretend that this cost of fossil fuel is 0, and let's pretend there's no policy risk. So rho is that probability and tau is the tax, so set that to 0 too. Then your ratio of clean to fossil capital is just the ratio of the factor shares in that Cobb-Douglas production function for the final good. But then we do have a cost of fossil fuel, which is necessary to operate the fossil capital. So that in itself is pushing up the ratio of clean to fossil capital. And then we have this probability of a tax in the future. That's raising the expected operating cost of fossil capital in the future, so further pushing up that ratio of clean to fossil capital. And the other effect that we have going on is what we'll think of as the level effect, and that the risk of climate policy in the future reduces the total level of the capital stock. So this is kind of an ugly expression showing you the total level of the capital stock. The important part is simply that that policy risk term is showing up in the denominator, and so it's decreasing the level of the capital stock.
Excuse me, Stephie, can I ask, this expression describes the steady state? Is that correct?
This is yes, exactly. This is in the steady state where there's no tax, but there's this chance of a future tax. Exactly. And so we think, well, why is policy risk reducing the level of the capital stock? So we just think for a minute about a carbon tax. A carbon tax shifts the economy away from the privately optimal, not the socially optimal level of capital, which reduces the marginal product of capital and thus reduces the capital stock. A carbon tax, the possibility of a future carbon tax is then kind of reducing the expected marginal product of capital, which then reduces the level of capital. So what we see is that this chance of a future tax is reducing emissions, both because it means you're just producing less, capital is lower, and what you are producing, you're producing more cleanly. That ratio of clean to fossil capital is higher. So that's our simple model. To get kind of more realistic quantitative numbers, we make a couple of changes that don't change the intuition for the most part, but affect the numerics. So first, on the production side, we're going to add a non-energy sector and allow for labor allocation in the production of the intermediates. And then we'll solve for the full general equilibrium. So now we'll have risk-averse households that are making all the decisions. So on the production side, now we'll have our final good being produced from a CES function of the clean intermediate, the fossil intermediate, and a non-energy intermediate, where this non-energy intermediate is produced from non-energy capital and labor. And so non-energy capital is basically any capital that's not specialized to use fossil fuel, so it's not fossil capital, and it's not specialized to kind of replace fossil fuel or fossil capital, so it wouldn't be as categorized as clean either. So for example, think about a sewing machine. A sewing machine requires electricity to operate, but it doesn't care if that electricity comes from a solar panel or a coal boiler. So this would fall into our non-energy capital category. The other thing that we've added here that's important, aside from more parameter and TFP terms, is labor. And we're allowing for labor now to be used in the production of each of these different intermediates. And this is important because labor gives entrepreneurs another dimension along which they can respond to the climate policy risk. And this dimension differs from the capital dimension because the timing of the labor and the capital decisions are different. And that you have to decide your capital or your investment before you know if there's going to be a carbon tax in the future. So I choose next period's level of capital at the end of this period before the government has announced whether there'll be a tax. But labor is a more flexible input. And so labor, you're able to decide after you know whether there'll be a carbon tax in the future. And so this labor choice can mitigate some of the effects of climate policy risk. So for example, if I invested in a lot of clean capital thinking the government might introduce a tax, then I learned the government didn't introduce the tax, I hire a little bit less clean labor than I would normally hire to go with that amount of clean capital so that I can still adjust my production of the clean input in response. Then the second piece here is we're going to, now the economy will be inhabited by a continuum of infinitely lived identical households, where these households are comprised of workers and entrepreneurs. The workers are making labor supply decisions, and they can supply labor to any entrepreneur, not just the ones in their household, and they earn the market wage. So labor markets are perfectly competitive. And the entrepreneurs produce each intermediate, and they're earning profits. And both the workers and the entrepreneurs are making decisions to maximize expected lifetime welfare for their household. So to calibrate the model, again, we're thinking about the current US economy as being in this world where there's no carbon tax in place, but there's this chance that we might introduce a carbon tax in the future. We're going to set that potential future carbon tax equal to $45 a ton, kind of in line with current policy proposals. And we can explore different kind of sensitivities around that. The time period of the model will be 1 year. And we're going to focus, or what I want to focus on today at least, is how to pin down the probability of that $45 tax. So we'll take as given that there's this, the policy is this $45 tax. And then the question is, what probability are firms in the US economy placing on that tax in the future? So to try to do our best to pin down the probability, we're going to look at US firms' voluntary emissions reductions. And so firms are taking lots of different approaches in the US economy to voluntarily reduce their emissions, not required by any kind of policy. So some of them are using their own energy efficiency or emissions targets. Others are imposing regulations that are stricter than what's required. And others are using what's known as internal carbon prices. And so what we want to know first is how much are firms voluntarily reducing their emissions? And then once we understand that, we can say, what probability would firms have to place on that $45 a ton carbon tax to justify their voluntary abatement efforts? I.e., what would make that emissions reduction optimal in the context of our model? So to do this, first we have to get at how much are they reducing emissions? And one of these mechanisms lets us kind of measure that. And that's what's known as an internal carbon fee, which is a type of internal carbon price, in which it's basically a tax that the firm places on its emissions. So for example, Microsoft has an internal carbon fee of $10 a ton. It's a tax it places on all of its emissions, and it rebates the revenue, I think, for carbon offsets. Now, according to firm surveys, the primary motivation for using these internal carbon fees is to distort investment in the face of future regulatory risk. But we want to be a little bit careful here, because there could be other reasons for using internal carbon fees and for reducing your emissions more generally than just the risk of a climate policy in the future. And that you could want to reduce your emissions because you want to differentiate your product as being green, or just because it's the right thing to do, this idea of corporate social responsibility. And so we don't know how much of this internal fee is motivated by climate policy risk and how much is motivated by potentially other motives. So what we're going to do is we'll say, okay, let's look at the modal internal carbon fee that we see among admittedly a small sample of firms that we have, which is about $10 a ton of CO2. And let's adjust that fee downward by 50% to $5 a ton and say, okay, half of the fee is motivated by policy risk and the other half is motivated by other stuff. Now, of course, we don't know that $5 a ton is the right amount to adjust that downward by. And so what we do in the paper is we then report the results for a range of calibrations going from 0 to the full $10 a ton. But what I'll show you today is just the results for the $5 a ton. In general, you should think results get larger as that internal fee gets bigger. So what we do is we say, okay, we see firms placing this $5 a ton tax on their emissions voluntarily, and viewing that as their response to policy risk. So to calibrate ROE, let's just think about a simple example. Suppose that when firms place that $5 a ton internal fee on themselves, This reduces their ratio of fossil to clean capital by 10% relative to what it would have been had they not put on any tax. We're going to interpret that as the economy's optimal response to climate policy risk. And so then we're going to choose rho such that it would be optimal to reduce your ratio of fossil to clean capital by 10% relative to a world with no risk, right? with rho equal to 0. Mechanically, what we do is we solve the model for a steady state where we have this internal fee and there's no risk. We solve for another steady state where there's risk and there's no fee, and we choose rho so that the ratio of fossil to clean capital is the same between both those steady states. And this gives us a rho of about 10%, which implies there's roughly a 50% chance that the government would introduce a carbon tax at some point in the next 8 years. So turning to the results, I want to use our calibrated model to look at 3 things. First is to show that this risk of climate policy alone reduces emissions a little bit. And then to look at how this thing affects how we think about cost of inaction on climate policy and for how we evaluate potential future climate policies. So beginning with the first point, we're going to compare 3 different steady states. The first is a steady state in which there's no carbon tax and there's no risk of a future carbon tax. Second is a steady state where we have the $45 carbon tax is already in place, and again, there's no risk in that world either. So comparing these 2 steady states provides us with a familiar point of reference. This is the exercise that's normally done in the literature. Then the third steady state is a steady state in which there's no tax, but there's this 10% chance of a $45 tax in the future, and that's our no tax steady state with risk. So comparing the first and the third steady states lets us get at the effects of risk. So I want to start with that familiar reference point. So what this graph is showing you is the effect of putting on that $45 a ton tax on emissions, capital, and the ratios of clean to fossil capital, labor, and intermediates between the world with the tax and the world in which there's no tax and no risk. And so you can see that the tax reduces emissions by about 15%, and that emissions reductions happens through those same level and composition channels that we talked about before, and that the level of capital is lower because the carbon tax has reduced the marginal product of capital, and the ratios of clean to fossil capital, labor, and intermediates are higher. So both of those channels are active. Now we can compare what happens when this graph, which is the effect of actually having the policy, compared to what just the effect of the risk of the policy, but not actually having the policy. And so that's going to be these blue bars. The first thing to notice about the blue bars is they all point in the same direction as the green bars. And so there's this sense in which climate policy risk moves the economy part of the way to that long-run steady state with the carbon tax actually in place. Now, if we focus just on emissions, you can see that you get a small reduction in emissions just from the risk of the policy alone. And so to put that reduction in perspective, the height of the blue bar is about 8% of the height of the green bar. And so 8% of the emissions reduction that you would measure going from a world with no tax and no risk to a world with the tax, you're getting just from the risk of the tax alone. So what I want to do next is zoom in on these blue bars because they're kind of hard to see with the green bars. So this is the same set of bars, just a different scale. And now we can look at how climate policy risk operates through that level and composition effect to reduce emissions. And so we see that climate policy risk is reducing the capital stock. So we're reducing emissions because we're producing less. And it's shifting the economy towards cleaner production, and that the ratios of clean to fossil capital, labor, and intermediates are all rising. But importantly here, notice that the ratio of clean to fossil capital is rising less than the ratio of clean to fossil labor. And this is coming back to that different timing of the capital and labor decisions, and that I invest in a lot of clean capital because I think the government's going to introduce a tax. Then I find out the government didn't introduce the tax, so I don't hire as much labor as I would normally hire to go with that clean capital. So the ratio of clean to fossil labor rises by less. What this is going to imply is that essentially the carbon tax is creating misallocation, and that it's distorting the capital labor or the capital labor ratio, the risk of a carbon tax. So what I want to do next is think about how the emissions reduction created by climate policy risk compares to emissions reduction that we would get from using an actual carbon tax that gives you that same reduction in emissions. So we can solve for a carbon tax that gives us that same reduction in emissions in a world with no risk, and that works out to be $3.21 per ton. And then we can think about how does that carbon tax operate through the level and composition channels compared to the climate policy risk. And so that's the purple bars. And what you see here, and what ends up being important, is that the carbon tax is relying much less on the level effect to reduce emissions, and that it's not reducing the capital stock by as much, and it's relying more on the composition effect that is shifting the economy towards cleaner capital. And this is going to matter because if we basically, climate policy risk is reducing emissions more by just shutting down production, and that's going to make it more costly than the actual carbon tax would be. And there are a couple of reasons why the level effect is larger under the climate policy risk. One of them comes back to this kind of distortion of the capital labor ratio, and that the actual carbon tax does not distort the capital labor ratio. There's no uncertainty, so this kind of different timing of the capital and labor decisions doesn't matter. But the climate policy risk does distort that ratio, which creates the misallocation, which further reduces the marginal product of capital and kind of exacerbates that level effect. So what we can do next is think about what the implications are from climate policy risk for the cost of inaction on climate policy. And there's the sense in which maybe the cost of inaction are a little bit smaller than we thought, because we're getting some emissions reduction, even though we don't actually have a climate policy in place. But then there are costs of that risk too. And if we think about calculating welfare using a consumption equivalent variation measure, we can calculate the welfare cost of climate policy risk and compare that to the welfare cost of that $3.21 tax. Both of those have the same environmental benefits, which as Francisco pointed out, are not modeled. But what we find is that the welfare cost of that climate policy risk is about twice as high as the tax, making just risk a very costly way to reduce emissions. And several reasons for this. One is that households are risk averse, so they don't like the risk. And two is, again, what we saw before, that you have this larger level effect. There's a bigger reduction in the total capital stock from the climate policy risk, which means that output and consumption are lower. And so then when we started this project, we were thinking, at least, that accounting for the fact that agents anticipate that we could introduce a climate policy in the future might actually reduce the welfare cost of introducing the policy. It would make it easier to introduce the policy because we've already done some of the adjustment. And what we found is that really doesn't turn out to be the case, and that the welfare cost of introducing a carbon tax, beginning in a world where agents anticipate that you might introduce the tax in the future, is almost identical to the welfare cost if you begin in a world where agents don't anticipate that you could introduce this tax in the future. And the reason is that they're two offsetting channels. First is this idea that climate policy risk does take you partway to that long-run steady state. So some of the adjustment has already taken place. So that is reducing the welfare cost. But then working in the other direction, if you begin in this world with climate policy risk, then you're beginning with a lower level of capital. And so you're less able to kind of dissave over the transition. And that's going to push up the welfare costs of starting from that world with climate policy risk. And those two channels almost perfectly offset. And so welfare costs of introducing a carbon tax are virtually the same, regardless of whether you start from a world with climate policy risk or without climate policy risk. And then the last point that we want to make is that climate policy risk matters for how we evaluate different future climate policies. And typically, to evaluate climate policy, we compare emissions under the policy with emissions in the current economy. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we model the current economy? And should we do kind of the previous approach in the literature, which is basically to say, let's think about a steady state where there's no risk of a future tax, or instead should we think about a world where there is this risk of a tax? And what we show is if you think the world is better represented by kind of something in which agents internalize there could be a tax in the future, then by abstracting from that, you're going to overstate the effects of actually introducing a climate policy. And so what this is showing you is the reduction in emissions. This first column is the reduction I would measure if I begin in a steady state with the climate policy risk. And the second is if I think about the baseline steady state as a steady state without climate policy risk. And so you can see you overstate the emissions reduction by about 1 percentage point if you abstract from the climate policy risk and view the world as this no risk steady state. And you see similar implications for the composition of capital and the level effect that changes in total capital output and consumption. So what I want to talk about with my last 5 minutes is to think about our paper in the context of this literature on the green paradox. And this is important because the literature on the green paradox has the opposite prediction, and that we're finding that this risk of future climate policy reduces emissions today, while the green paradox literature is arguing that the risk of future climate policy can increase emissions today. And so the green paradox is really beginning at a different starting point, in that they're starting from this premise that fossil fuels is an exhaustible resource, and the implications of climate policy risk for the extraction dynamics from fossil fuel are really important for this crucial to this argument that climate policy risk could increase emissions today. So what I want to do is first just walk through the argument from the green paradox literature, and then think about our paper in that context, and then finally run a reduced form horse race between the predictions from the green paradox literature and our paper. So the backbone of the green paradox argument is this hoteling model of fossil fuel supply. So this is showing you, the blue line here is just demand for fossil fuel. The red line is the marginal extraction cost. I've made that to be constant, just like it is in our baseline model. The price of fossil fuel is above the marginal extraction cost because of the scarcity rents. And then this picture on the right is just showing you the same thing, but for tomorrow, so for next period. And what you see is fossil fuel prices rising at the rate of interest, which is kind of the fundamental prediction of the hoteling model. So lots of papers have shown, that the hoteling model does kind of a poor job at predicting fossil fuel price dynamics. And that might be why, a lot of climate economy models don't model fossil fuel as an exhaustible resource. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're just going to take the green paradox argument and the hoteling model as given. And so then what the green paradox would say is, okay, we think there might be a climate policy in the future, so that's going to reduce expected demand for fossil fuel tomorrow, making it less profitable to extract this fossil fuel resource tomorrow. Fossil fuel extractors are solving this dynamic extraction problem, so it's less profitable to extract tomorrow, so they're going to bring extraction forward and extract more today. So that's going to increase fossil fuel extraction today, and this gives you that green paradox prediction that this would also increase emissions today. So now what's our paper saying? So if we think about our paper is saying, well, this threat of climate policy in the future is affecting emissions today because it's affecting the composition of capital and the total level of capital. And that capital channel is showing up as a decrease in demand for fossil fuel today. And so that shift in demand, moving to the left, holding everything else constant, would reduce emissions today. And so now the question becomes, well, which effect is bigger in some sense? So is it this supply side response where the possibility of future climate policies causing fossil fuel producers to bring extraction forward, or this demand side response where the change in kind of demands for capital is reducing demand for fossil fuel today? So to get at that, or to try and understand how the sizes of these effects compare, what we're going to do is focus on the implications of climate policy risk for the price of fossil fuel when you have this hoteling type model of fossil fuel extraction. So first, this picture on the right, this is our baseline model that we just walked through. And what you see here is the price of fossil fuel is always equal to the marginal extraction cost. It doesn't change regardless of whether or not there's climate policy risk, it's the same. If instead we come over to this green paradox setting where now we're in a hoteling world, the price of fossil fuel is above the marginal extraction cost. And importantly, if I remove the policy risk, the price of fossil fuel is going to go up to the red P, both because this demand curve for fossil fuel would shift out, and because when I remove policy risk, I'm going to push extraction forward because now it's more profitable to extract in the future relative to what it was when I thought there would be a carbon tax in the future. That's also going to push the price of fossil fuel up. So to bring in this green paradox mechanism into our model, we're going to say, suppose that the price of fossil fuel in that steady state with no carbon tax and no risk is actually higher than the price of fossil fuel in the steady state with the carbon tax and with risk. And so the question then becomes, how much higher should that price of fossil fuel be? And so for that, we're going to draw on the empirical literature on the green paradox. And so Derek Lemoine has a really nice paper where he's looking at how changes in congressional support for the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill, which would have established a cap and trade system in the US if it had passed the Senate, affect coal prices. And then Kyle Mang kind of does the second step of that and says, well, how do changes in congressional support for the Waxman-Markey bill affect the probability that the bill would be passed? So combining these two papers together, we can get at how do changes in the probability of a policy affect coal prices, and we go from there to fossil fuel prices. And so bringing these two papers together, what we find is that decreasing the probability of a carbon tax from 10% to 0 would give you a 2.5% increase in the fossil fuel price. Now we want to decrease it from 10% to 0 because at 10%, that's our steady state where there's risk, but there's no tax. And then going all the way to 0 would be, let's go instead to that steady state where there's no tax and there's no risk. And what this is saying is, in that world, the green paradox implies the fossil fuel price should be 2.5% higher. So if we do that, then what we'll find is climate policy risk reduces emissions by about 0.5% instead of by the 1.15% that we found in our original model. So again, comparing emissions in the steady state with climate policy risk and no tax to emissions in a steady state with no risk, no tax, but a 2.5% higher fossil fuel price, what you'll see is emissions are about 0.5% lower with policy risk. So the effects are more muted when we bring in the green paradox, but it seems, at least from these calculations, that the kind of demand side channels are stronger than that supply side channels from the green paradox literature. So I think I'm out of time, but that's everything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's see who wants to jump in.
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
So in light of Eugenie's paper this morning, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on if we added directed technical change as a dimension into this, whether your original intuition would be correct again, that with the adding to the two effects welfare channels, right, that in addition, if there's directed technical change now, we might again be in a situation where it's cheaper to introduce the carbon tax, if you've given that any thought.
Oh, I see. So in some sense, oh, that's a very interesting idea. So in some sense, if we have the directed technical change, then yes, we're at this lower capital stock, but now it's just also easier to reduce emissions, not just from the investment, but because we know more. No, that's a very interesting point. Then we might, that might tip us in the right direction. I like that idea.
I'd like to comment on the issue if fossil fuels are like a finite resources. And I'm pretty sure that unless we want to kill ourselves, they are not finite. So there is, I mean, oil can be a debate, but coal, there is more than enough. So I'm pretty sure about this. And I guess Ottmar Edenhofer will also make this point tonight, that this is why we need the CO2 price. Otherwise, we have enough cheap coal to finish ourselves with present day technology.
No, I mean, I agree with you. And then kind of in our baseline specification, they're modeled as an infinite resource for exactly that reason.
Okay.
I don't see anything in the chat or in the Q&A. Let me remind the attendees that they can signal their wish to ask a question through the chat or to the Q&A function, or even raising their blue hand. So I'll keep looking at that. But while I look at that, can I also ask a question? Maybe this doesn't matter too much for the focus of your paper, but something in me rebels against this idea that the baseline scenario is one where there is not only no tax, but also no climate change. And, we've been seeing papers, which I think rightly tell us that with climate change, the business as usual scenario is one where TFP goes down a lot. So in that world, I'm thinking without the tax, and even without the risk of a tax, investment goes down a lot because future TFP goes down a lot. And then if you give me even a chance or what you call a risk, in which I would prefer to call a hope or a carbon tax, then I say, well, maybe TFP is not going to fall as much because there is some chance that sanity prevails and we tax carbon. And then I want to invest, and then I'm going to invest more, and the capital will go up instead. So in my mind, every time you show a picture that the carbon tax risk lower aggregate investment, in my mind says no, the carbon tax risk increases investment compared to the situation where there is no carbon tax risk. Of course, if the carbon tax actually arrives, it's going to be even bigger. So that I don't know if that matters for what you care about, but I thought I would share that view.
No, I think that's a great point, right? And if we're thinking about, this, it comes down to this challenging question where it's not just the US, or it's not just Europe, it's like the whole world has to do something. And so if we were to think about this as not climate policy risk as the US taking action, but climate policy risk as kind of a global coordinated effort, then we could think about, there being these benefits from reducing emissions that we should be internalizing here too. And so if instead you're saying, okay, the US does something, and if we abstract from actions of the rest of the world, the kind of immediate effects or near-term effects on climate damage for the US would probably be relatively small. And so that's kind of why
sorry, I beg to differ. That would be true for Costa Rica, but the US is the biggest emitter, one of the biggest emitters. I think that's a hard defense for me to swallow.
It's a big emitter, but it's still.
The US is huge. It's a huge emitter.
Okay, we should bring it in.
Also, quickly ask the question. So yesterday, Bob Pindyck said, in light of all the damage uncertainty, we should take action now, and that was a bit like had a normative flavor. But if you combine your setup with impact uncertainty, then out of political economy perspectives, you would always find someone who says we don't need to take action now, and that infuses policy uncertainty. But if you had also impact uncertainty in your model, probably from a normative perspective, you would say we should take action now. Could that be?
Yeah, we can think about that.
Okay.
Sorry, I got distracted and I wasn't following the chat. Let me tell you what's going on there. Okay, Matthew Kahn, well, he says that the US is 20% of global emissions. I don't know if he's saying it to support my point or your point. It could go either way.
I agree with you. We should look at the damage side. We haven't.
Ibrahim says implementing a carbon tax can be affected by the political polarization, for example, in the US. Is the model take into consideration this type of issue when measuring the probability of implementing a climate policy? I think what he's saying is that these probabilities, this climate policy risk will change can change quite a bit. I guess you mentioned it with Biden reversing the Trump policies. But I think that's an interesting, asking questions about maybe also a way of testing the model. You go from one. Maybe I'm misinterpreting the point that Ibrahim is making, but maybe you can use the political swings as tests of the model to see if the changes in composition of investment go the way that the changes in probabilities go. And then Rafael Abiri, a different point, do you have some hunch results how policy risk affects the spread between clean and dirty fossil assets? So I guess this is a question about the financial market implications. And so I'll let you take that question, or both those questions, and then we'll move to the next paper.
Okay. Well, thank you. No, we haven't really set up the model to be able to look at the asset market implications. So I think that's interesting. But we haven't built it to be able to do that yet, at least. So that's something we could definitely explore though in the future. Yeah, and the political question is also interesting. We've thought a bit about, can we use these different, these events as kind of distinct shifts in the probability to try and test some of those implications. We haven't quite come up with a clean test yet, but I think that's also a good idea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephie, for this very clear and interesting presentation. And the next speaker is Lint Barrage on the fiscal cost of climate change.
All right, thank you so much. Great, and thanks also to the organizers for putting together this conference. I think it's been really enjoyable for everyone. So the objective of this paper is to investigate climate change's fiscal impacts and their policy implications. And conceptually, you might think of climate change as affecting public budgets in at least 3 ways. So first, climate change may alter the cost of existing government programs, such as publicly provided healthcare or wildfire suppression. Second, certain climate change adaptation measures, such as coastal infrastructure, will likely have to be publicly provided and thus financed. And third, through its effects on the macroeconomy, we might expect climate change to affect the amounts of revenues that are collected from a given income tax structure. Now, despite this intuitive relevance, benchmark models that are used to quantify the social cost of carbon generally do not consider fiscal costs. So certain types of impacts, such as healthcare costs, are often omitted altogether. And these models typically focus on carbon pricing as the only government activity. But again, we might intuitively think that these costs are relevant. And in particular, if governments raise revenues with distortionary taxes, such as capital and labor income taxes, we know that it's socially extra costly to raise revenues and divert funds to deal with climate change. We might also be concerned that fiscal constraints can lower adaptation, thus potentially increasing damages relative to what we might expect. And then third, I also show that the social cost of carbon ought to account for fiscal costs structurally. So more formally, the goals of this paper and the plan is to integrate, or at least attempt to integrate, fiscal costs into a climate economic integrated assessment model. So first, I'm going to describe a bottom-up quantification of aggregate fiscal impacts. This is an attempt to construct a fiscal damage function for climate change for the United States. And I do this both based on the synthesis of prior literature and through empirical estimates of public healthcare costs associated with extreme cold, extreme hot, and wildfire events. Second, I developed a macro climate economy model with fiscal impacts to think conceptually about what the implication of fiscal costs for the social cost of carbon might be. And then third, I'm going to present a quantitative model for the US economy. So before we get lost in detail, because I'm sure people are a little tired, let me first summarize the main results before getting into the details. So first, I find that fiscal costs appear quantitatively significant. So at 2.5-degree warming, this is a common business as usual projection for about mid-century, about 2055. The benchmark estimates imply an increase in government consumption of 1.2% and an increase in transfer payments of 1/3%. The majority of this is due to healthcare cost increases. And to put these figures in perspective, the Rice model by Bill Nordhaus projects total US damages to be about 0.9% of GDP at 2.5-degree warming. And again, this does not include fiscal costs, so it's a substantial increase over this benchmark cost estimate. Second, structurally, I find that the social cost of carbon really ought to account for fiscal costs, both impacts on government consumption, and if revenues are raised with distortionary taxes, also climate change impacts on government transfer payments. So intuitively, if there's more hurricane activity, more disruptions to labor market, more unemployment insurance, and we have strong empirical evidence that climate change leads to increases in transfer payments, then we normally don't think of those as welfare relevant, but in this setting, we ought to account for them. And more specifically for the fact that if revenues are raised with distortionary taxes, increases in transfer payments alter the set of equilibria that can be decentralized as a competitive equilibrium, which here induces a social cost. And then third, I again would argue that fiscal costs have first-order climate policy welfare implications. So since the quantification of fiscal costs is highly uncertain, I look at the effect of the social cost of carbon over a range of what these fiscal costs or these damage functions might look like. And I find an elasticity of the US social cost of carbon with respect to government consumption impacts per degree warming of 20, and an elasticity of the social cost of carbon with respect to government transfer impacts per degree warming of about 10. More broadly, accounting for the fiscal setting increases the projected welfare benefits associated with carbon pricing by up to 300%. And now this is accounting for both the revenue benefits and the effects of reductions in climate change on public consumption and revenue requirements.
Sorry, Lint, can I just stop you there just for a clarification? Yeah. Why are this elasticity different for government consumption and government transfers? Can you guys just give me the intuition? I'm sure I'm missing something very basic.
Yeah, so for government consumption, it's basically dollar for dollar. It's just the value of the externality. For transfer impacts, $1 of extra transfer payments, the social cost of it is not $1. So the social cost of the increase in transfer payment depends on what the marginal cost of public funds required to raise them is, but also on precisely how increases in transfer payments affect households' offer curves, and thus the set of equilibria that can be decentralized as a competitive equilibrium. So I'll have an expression for that later on.
So is there an assumption somewhere behind this that government consumption doesn't increase utility?
It does not increase. So there's a fixed level of government consumption that has to be met, and potentially this level increases due to climate, or decreases actually due to climate change. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for those questions. All right, so before proceeding, I briefly want to put this in the context of the literature, stand on very rich, not rich shoulders, large shoulders of the climate economy modeling literature, including some work that has studied adaptation, but again, typically abstracts from the fiscal side of things. So that's where my focus lies. There's also a very rich literature that has studied interactions between environmental policy and pre-existing taxes. Rick has obviously done some of the groundbreaking work in this literature, where here the contribution is to focus on the climate impact side, both on the economy and on public budgets and expenditures. And I tie into a growing literature that empirically estimates the impacts of climate change, including on public expenditures, revenues, and the goal here is both to integrate some of the existing estimates into the structure of a model and to contribute some estimates on the healthcare front. So the structure of the remainder of my remarks is going to be, first, I'm going to talk about the quantification of fiscal costs, then the model and conceptually how we think about their implications, and then the numerical results. So first, there are quite a few studies that have already looked at this issue quantitatively and or empirically. So I synthesize estimates that I've been able to find. If people know of more, I would love to hear about them, because the more information I have, the better, and synthesize them into a damage function. So this includes estimates of climate change impacts on the cost of crop insurance subsidies. So for example, in the United States, crop insurance is heavily subsidized by the government. The majority of premiums are actually publicly provided. So to the extent that crop insurance prices will increase, that will in part be borne by the government. There's estimates of federal wildfire suppression cost changes due to the U.S. Forest Service, of hurricane-related public disaster spending changes due to the Congressional Budget Office, of federal health expenditure changes due to changes in general air quality. There's estimates of increased incidence of West Nile neuroinvasive disease and associated healthcare spending, of changes in requirements for urban drainage infrastructure to keep up with climate change, and changes in the cost of the Endangered Species Act. Second, I also extend Tatiana De Regina has produced some very careful estimates of the fiscal costs of hurricanes, and including impacts on healthcare expenditures and government transfer payments, again, unemployment insurance, income support to families that whose income has been affected. And I combine those with projections of increases in hurricane activity, or I should say changes in the United States by Carrie Manuel, to translate that into a damage function. And then looking at those, one thing that was quite striking is how big the healthcare cost component is, relatively speaking. So for some estimates that I was able to find in the literature, I decided to look at the data myself. So to look at the healthcare cost impacts of extreme heat, cold, and wildfire events, I build on empirical methods that have been developed by the Climate Impacts Lab in Max Alfama to think about how to construct empirical estimates of climate impacts. So what Max Alfama calls the climate adaptive response estimation uses panel variation in weather events. So we look in a given county, in some years there's more or fewer extremely hot days. We use that variation to identify plausibly causal impact estimates. But then we account for adaptation to a change in climate by allowing the marginal effect of another hot day to be a function of the baseline climate in a given location. So more specifically, I regress public medical spending in a given county year on these climate event indicators. So for example, the number of very hot days and the number of very hot days interacted with the county's average number of very hot days per year. And again, this is so that right now, we allow the effects of a hot day on public medical expenditures to be different in Maine than in Arizona, because Arizona is much more adapted to heat than Maine is. In simulating impacts forward, this will also allow us to account for the fact that the effect of a hot day in Maine is going to be different in 2020 than in 2080, at which point Maine will have presumably adapted to some extent to warming. In addition to these climate coefficients, I include county fixed effects, year fixed effects, state-specific trends. So this is to allow California to have different medical spending trends than Wyoming, and a rich set of demographic, economic, and other climatic, such as precipitation controls. And so this graph, this map shows what estimated marginal public health care impacts of a very hot day. This is maximum temperature above 35 degrees looks like, where damages are evaluated at current baseline climate. And so we see that the increase in public health care expenditures is much bigger in northern regions that are not very used to hot temperatures at present. In areas such as Texas that appear well adapted to the heat, we see very little impact of another hot day on public health care expenditures. For wildfires, I estimate an elasticity that a 1% increase in wildfire or smoke days increases public health spending on average by 0.08%. For cold temperatures, I have to be careful. Those estimates are not very precise. Sometimes they are, they're not, they're noisier. I suspect that's because of the way that I'm defining the cold right now. So I have some work to do in figuring out exactly where the impacts do or do not lie. But for completeness, I wanted to show there is a much smaller but still increase in public health care expenditures associated with freezing days in areas that are not very used to having them. Right, and if you remember what we saw in Texas a few weeks ago, when there's freezing weather in Texas, as is consistent with these estimates, there is the potential for healthcare impacts. So then to translate these estimates into projections of future costs due to climate change, I use predictions for county level temperature changes due to Rasmussen et al., and survey the literature and projected increases in wildfire activity, focusing on the top quartile of wildfire states in the US per degree warming. And in some states, I'm in California, on the average prediction from the literature is an 80% increase in annual wildfire activity per degree warming. That's rather frightening, but here we are. So with that, I first just want to show for a sense of the orders of magnitude, this is again from the Rasmussen et al. Data, the predicted change in very hot days, these are days with the maximum temperature above 35 Celsius, by mid-century in a high emission scenario. And for some of these dark red areas, you can see it's up to 88 additional very hot days per year predicted under a high warming scenario. This is quite a substantial increase in the number of very hot days. Combining then the predicted increase in number of very hot days with predicted public health costs per extra hot day, we can obtain estimates for the level change in public health care expenditures due to extreme heat by mid-century. And we see that this is mainly concentrated in areas that currently are not very well adapted to high heat, but are predicted to suffer the biggest increase in very hot days. And in terms of magnitudes, in some of these most affected areas, it's up to a 0.5% increase in healthcare expenditures, which is arguably certainly not trivial. Now, again, the important thing about this climate adaptive response estimation is it accounts for the fact that as time goes on, so this is the public healthcare cost impact map for end of century, these regions are predicted to adapt to climate change so that the biggest cost increases later in the century are predicted to occur in the more northern parts of the United States. And then for wildfires, again, I focus on just the top quartile of wildfire states, where again, in terms of order of magnitude, the predicted healthcare impacts are about a 0.5% increase at 2.5 degree warming by mid-century. So when we sum up these different impact estimates, again, based on the literature and based on these quantification, we end up with a headline number at 2.5 degree warming of about a 1% increase in consumption from existing programs. If you remember before, I said 1.2% total consumption that includes endogenously financed DLRIs adaptation. And then for income support, transfer payments in response to hurricane events, it's about 1/3%. So this is just to keep track of where we are. This was the quantification of existing program cost changes. And now we also want to think about endogenous potential additional government expenditures that might occur in response to climate change. And I end up focusing on the one adaptation margin where there's good quantitative basis for quantifying a public adaptation cost function, which is adaptation to sea level rise. So I quantify the government's options for investing in protective infrastructure based on the EPA's coastal property model. So this is a detailed model of different property areas across the United States and their vulnerability to sea level rise and climate change. And I use the output from their runs for the 2018 National Climate Assessment to basically map my model into theirs. So the EPA's coastal property model keeps track of climate change impacts through storm surge impacts and abandoned property costs. And importantly for our purposes, also allows for and optimizes across 3 adaptation margins. This includes shoreline armoring, again, seawalls, levees, those kind of structures, beach nourishment, and elevation. And I put an adaptation cost function and end up quantifying it by minimizing the sum of squared errors between the EPA's detailed coastal property model and my simpler reduced form representation of it. All right. So with that, let me talk a little more about the model. So I build on some of the standard climate economy models in the literature, such as Dyson, Golisov et al., and some of my previous work, which introduces a very basic representation of fiscal policy. So this endogenizes labor supply, adds government consumption, government transfers, linear labor income taxes, linear capital income taxes, energy sector taxes, carbon taxes, and government bonds. And importantly, in the setting, we keep track of several climate change impact channels, whereas the literature often focuses on just one or 2 of those. But again, these are important for our setting. So we differentiate climate change impacts on the production side of the economy. This is productivity and final goods production. On household utilities, so these are non-market effects of climate change that alter utility but not production possibilities. Climate change impacts on capital depreciation through sea level rise. Climate change impacts on government consumption. Climate change impacts on government transfers, and potentially public adaptation efforts. The model assumes an infill lift. Yes,
Lint,
question.
So are all the agents the same? Is it like do you have heterogeneous agents?
I do not.
So everybody is the same. They're all this infinitely lived. There's no difference in incomes. Okay, so
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, so there is one representative agent with well-behaved preferences over consumption, labor, and climate change. And I'm further going to assume that utility over consumption and labor is separable from utility over temperature. Now, what Sol's presentation taught us yesterday is that that's not quite right, and that actually we should probably think of climate change as a relative complement with leisure. We have public finance theory to guide us in which way that would affect the results. It would likely lead to an increase in the social cost of carbon. We know this from prior theory, but I'm not accounting for those effects yet, but inspired by Sol's presentation, hopefully will at some point going forward. So the household spends their income on a general consumption good, on purchasing government bonds, and on investment. And the household derives their income from 1, after-tax labor income, 2, after-tax and depreciation capital income, where the depreciation rate depends on sea level rise and publicly provided adaptation against sea level rise. Bond repayments, profits from the energy sector, and government transfers, which again may also be a function of the climate T. There's 2 production sectors. One is the final goods sector, where an aggregate consumption investment good is produced using capital, labor, and energy inputs. And energy inputs are produced using capital and labor inputs, and some fraction mu of energy can be produced cleanly at an additional cost. So the government has to raise revenues to finance several expenditures. So these include household transfers, which may depend on the climate T, government consumption, which may also depend on the climate T. It has to repay initial debt, and if desired, raise revenues to finance sea level rise adaptation. Again, it has a set of linear income taxes, energy taxes, and carbon taxes, as well as bonds available to raise revenues. And a key concept in interpreting the one theoretical result that we have is going to be the marginal cost of public funds, which is the welfare cost of raising $1 additional of government revenue. So in our standard setting, where there's lump sum transfers, or we implicitly assume they're possible, that would be equal to 1. It costs $1 to take it out of private and put it into public hands. But if we have to raise revenues with distortionary instruments such as income taxes, the marginal cost of public funds is greater than 1, the remainder representing the marginal deadweight loss of a tax. Now, temperature change is going to be a function of the sum of US emissions and rest of the world emissions. And I'm going to assume that rest of the world emissions may or may not react to US emissions reductions as climate policy, with some elasticity. So if the US reduces emissions by 10%, the rest of the world may respond to this in principle positively or negatively or not at all. Finally, or penultimately, I should say, sea level rise in line with the semi-empirical model of Rahmstorff is modeled as a function of the history of temperature change in each time period up until time t. All right, and then finally, sea level rise damages affect the capital depreciation rate, and the government's provided adaptive capacity to protect against sea level rises between 0 and 1. So some fraction of sea level rise damages can be avoided through public investments in protective infrastructure. And I model and quantify the sea level rise damage functions again based on the EPA model, which suggests that linear damages, so this is the EPA model output of damages as a function of sea level rise, linear damage function is a decent approximation. All right. So with that structure, we can think about in this setting what the social cost of carbon should look like. And more formally, I find that the optimal carbon price in this world is implicitly defined by the sum of the following terms, which basically internalize each of the different impact channels of climate change. So the first is the present discounted value of output impacts. This is standard. The second is the present discounted value of utility impacts. And this is divided by the marginal cost of public funds to account for the fact that the household and the planner value a dollar of income differently. The third is sea level rise impacts. This is intuitive. And then finally, most of interest here, we want to internalize government consumption impacts because they're a loss in output that's no longer available due to climate change. And perhaps most surprisingly, we also want to account for government transfer impacts of climate change. Again, if we have to change transfer payments to household, if the marginal cost of public funds exceeds unity. So if the government can lever resources with lump sum taxes, no problem. We don't need to worry about transfers. They're not relevant for welfare. But here, because the marginal cost of public funds exceeds unity, we also have to internalize government transfer payments and specifically their impacts they have on households' offer curves and the general equilibrium welfare costs associated with that in a world with pre-existing tax distortions.
Sorry, Lint, can I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
You said that the sea level rise impact component is intuitive, but how does that work? That does not work through utility or through the output. It's a separate.
Yes. So
it's a separate
no.
welfare. It's a separate enters welfare separately from output and.
Yes. Yeah, so here it is. Sorry. My apologies, that was the wrong link. So it's basically the present discounted value in each future. So each ton of emissions, we keep track, how much does it change temperature in each future time period? And then we keep track of, in that time period, how much did having it be X% warmer contribute to ice melting and thus sea level rise in that period and then every subsequent period, right? Because sea level rise is a separate stock. Temperature is a stock, or carbon is a stock, and sea level rise is also a stock. So we keep track of how much emissions in each time period T contribute to temperature change in each period, and how that temperature change contributes to sea level rise, and then how that sea level rise contributes to cap depreciation in each future time period. And it's not the same as output impacts, just because the dynamics are different with sea level rise versus temperature. But so the DICE model includes sea level rise damages as an annualized output loss equivalent. So they're there. I just here make them explicit because we make adaptation explicit. Thank you for that question. Okay. And so now the next task is to quantify the remainder of the model. I already described the quantification of the fiscal side to then get at numerical results. So the output damages are quantified based on the Rice-Dice damage function, this quadratic damage function we've talked about a few times now in this conference, where I make a change by disaggregating damages based on the underlying estimates into those that are actually on the production side of the economy and those that are more likely on just the utility side of the economy. And this is important here because when we're thinking of the general equilibrium or the revenue effects of climate change, we want to make sure we don't count some utility impacts as affecting aggregate productivity. The fiscal model representation is obviously quite simple, but I obtain estimates of average effective tax rates in the baseline years for capital income from the Congressional Budget Office, for labor income from the OECD, for consumption based on the literature, and use this to quantify the business as usual income tax wedges. Government consumption and transfers are quantified based on US national income and product accounts, and I specify here also a quadratic damage function for both government transfer and government consumption impacts. The production side of the model matches base your output, labor supply, and carbon energy. Assumptions about future population productivity growth and abatement costs come from Rice. I should say the carbon and climate system right now are as in the DICE model, but one thing that's been on my to-do list based on work by Dietz et al., including Rick, that have raised some concerns about the DICE model carbon cycle and climate system, so that's still on my to-do list to update that in line with their work. I assume a Fiscal elasticity of labor supply of 1.83, and in the benchmark, I assume a rest of the world response elasticity to US emissions reductions of 0.3. Now, this turns out to affect the optimal level of the US carbon tax, but not really the conclusions about the role of fiscal costs from what I've experimented so far. So this ends up not being a very important parameter for what the focus of this paper is. So in terms of the numerical results, I first want to think just about fiscal cost levels. Is this big potatoes or small potatoes? And I should take that back and say, this is relying on such a small number of these, and there's so much uncertainty in everything. It's, there's vast uncertainties in this quantification. So I think the main takeaway here is just a plausible order of magnitude estimate. Is this, big potatoes or small potatoes? And I think it's decent potatoes. So here's projected fiscal costs or total expenditure impacts in each decade going forward, broken down by government consumption, transfers, and coastal protection expenditures. And so right now it's projected to already be at about 25 billion a year. This is roughly between the annual budgets of NASA and the State Department, increasing to about $80 billion a year by mid-century. Now, again, these precise numerical estimates are uncertain, so I consider for a range of what fiscal costs might potentially look like, the effect on the social cost of carbon. And so this is for government consumption and government transfer impacts, how much the optimal carbon tax increases as a function of the projected spending increase per degree warming. And again, so for government consumption impacts, I estimate an elasticity of about 20. So each 1% increase in government expenditures per degree warming increases the social cost of carbon by about 20%. And for transfers, it's about 10%.
Sorry, Lint, can I ask you a question about the interpretation of these numbers?
Yes.
Are these computed under the optimal carbon tax?
Yes.
Okay.
When you say
somewhat, sorry.
just a question, are you maximizing some representative agent's lifetime, utility to figure out what the optimal tax is, or?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so there's an underlying utility function over time. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. You said earlier that that the social cost of carbon could be 300% larger. So the tax would be 3 times bigger?
No, I apologize if I misspoke. It's not the social cost of carbon that's 300% bigger. It's the welfare gain associated with having a carbon tax in the US. That's up to 300% bigger. So I'm about to get to that on the next slide, if I may.
Okay, that's.
Or was there a question about that?
No, that's.
I could.
I'm just surprised. That's huge. That sounds like a huge result or number.
Well, yeah, I apologize if I misspoke. It's not the social cost of carbon. It's the welfare gains associated with the carbon price.
With a carbon tax, yeah, but if it's 3 times larger, that's a big deal. Right?
Yes, now a lot of that comes from the revenue benefits. Let me be clear about what I mean by that number on the next slide, if I may.
Okay.
So I'm going to be specifically in where this number comes from is a comparison from across 4 income tax and 2 carbon and energy tax scenarios. So I'm going to be comparing first best income tax scenarios where the government is assumed to have access to non-distortionary lump sum taxes. So this is an implicit benchmark assumption in many studies. Then I'm going to consider a setting where the government can't raise revenues with lump sum levies. It has to use income taxes, but it can fully optimize them. So this is optimized distortionary taxes. And then I'm going to consider 2 business as usual effective tax rate scenarios where either capital or labor income taxes are fixed at current levels and the government varies the other instrument to raise additional revenues. For carbon and energy taxes, I'm going to be comparing a scenario with no carbon or energy taxes until the end of the century and one where those are fully optimized. And so first, if we're in a standard setting, a first best setting, if the government can use lump sum taxes to finance its expenditures, it will do so. No carbon tax, no capital income tax, no labor tax, and marginal cost of public funds of unity. And in this setting, introducing the optimal US carbon tax introduces a welfare gain of about $300 billion. So this is US only. This is not considering rest of the world impacts.
I need to stop you. Can you explain why in the first best, the carbon tax is zero? I mean, you can't.
Oh, my apologies. I wasn't clear. We're comparing, there's two scenarios that we're comparing. We're comparing a scenario with first best income taxes, no carbon and energy tax. So there's no carbon tax, to a scenario with an optimized carbon tax, which this is the welfare difference between the first and second scenario in this row.
Okay.
Yes, sorry if that was not clear. I'm now going to be comparing this with an optimized world where taxes are distortionary but optimized. So the government uses mostly labor income taxes and a little bit of capital income taxes to raise revenues. The marginal cost of public funds at this optimized point is 1.1. And then if we compare a scenario without a carbon tax to one with a carbon tax, we get a welfare benefit of the carbon tax that's about 50% higher than in the first best. And this is due to now a combination of effects. So one, the carbon tax saves, reduces global temperature change, reducing climate damages. That saves on some revenues that we now don't need to raise. In addition, the revenues raised by the carbon tax itself can also be used to offset other taxes. And so this allows a reduction in labor income taxes of 0.1% and a reduction of capital income taxes of almost 1%. So the welfare benefit here is bigger, both basically because the revenues matter more in this setting.
So Lynn,
Yes.
is this the, you said, is this like $500 billion for the entire path of the economy forever in present value? Or
Yes.
is this half a trillion per year?
No, this is if the scenario is how much I have to give you in the initial period to make you indifferent between the world with the carbon tax and without.
So that seems really small as a gain from carbon taxation. I don't know, $500 billion. I mean, it's like, got $20 trillion GDP, right? So we're talking about, it's I don't know. Does that strike you as small or large, or?
It's small. So if that's, but it's for reasons that I can explain. So first of all, this is US only. So we're ignoring rest of the world emissions. If we had a global benefit, I think typical estimates are about 20 trillion benefit of the optimized carbon tax. So it's a lot smaller than that. And it's also because I'm using the Rice US damage function, which is quite modest, right? It's 0.9% of GDP loss due to 2.5-degree warming. That's quite modest. So Sol and co-authors have a paper from 2017 where they estimate US damages of 1.5% GDP loss due to 2.5-degree warming. If I use that damage function, these numbers would be substantially larger. So this is just by using a very modest damage function and also focusing only on US emissions.
So just to be clear, this is about a 2.5% drop in consumption once for all the infinite gains in the climate you get forever after. But it's $500 billion is about of 20 is about 2.5%, isn't it?
Well, I guess it's 2.5% every year of consumption.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that seems very low, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I guess in some ways it's not so low. I mean, it's a pretty good size excess burden.
I'd like to have it in my pocket.
Yeah. So maybe it's not. Maybe.
I can also tell you the number would be a lot bigger, and I have a button on in a couple of slides if we assume a larger global mitigation response elasticity, right? So right now a U.S. carbon tax only reduces US emissions and a little bit the rest of the world emissions. So the climate protection gains of it are modest. If we had a larger rest of the world response to carbon emissions, we would have correspondingly larger welfare gains for the US associated with that policy. So the numbers differ a little bit from what we typically see, both because it's US damages only and US policy only, if that makes sense.
I mean, our model from yesterday is producing 5%. So this is 2.5%. It's not, as you said, you're using a more conservative damage function than we used. So, yeah.
Thank you for those questions, by the way. So next, I'm going to consider a business as usual fiscal scenario where labor income taxes are held fixed at business as usual levels And the marginal revenue raising instrument is capital income taxes. So then capital income taxes are going to have to be substantial compared to the optimized setting, and the marginal cost of public funds is correspondingly higher. In this setting, introducing a carbon tax now creates a welfare gain of about $1 trillion. So this is where the 300% larger than in the benchmark comes from, because now the revenue value of both the carbon tax itself and the avoided climate damages and their fiscal impacts are correspondingly larger because the marginal public cost of funds is correspondingly larger. And again, the carbon tax and climate protection benefits allow a capital income tax reduction of about short of 1%. And then finally, in a setting where capital income taxes are held fixed and the marginal revenue raising instrument is labor income taxes, the marginal cost of public funds is a lot lower. So the revenue benefits of both the carbon tax and climate protection is lower, but we still have about a 20% greater welfare gain of carbon taxation than in the benchmark first best setting.
And I suppose the capital tax is time consistent in this model because there's not much dynamics in the Golosov model, or is it not time consistent?
It would not be time consistent.
So it requires pre-commitment, and if you don't allow that, the welfare gains will be perhaps quite a bit less.
The welfare gains, it's an interesting question. So Alex Schmidt has done the carbon tax in this type of optimal taxation setting without commitment. He finds that the optimal carbon tax is quite similar with and without commitment. I don't recall his results for welfare benefits associated with carbon taxes alongside capital income taxes, but I could check that. So that's where I would go. For the optimal carbon tax, it doesn't make a much of a difference at all, the commitment assumption. But yes, I should check for welfare. All right. How am I doing on time? I'm probably almost out of time.
I mean, if you can begin to wrap up, then we can have a few minutes left for discussion.
Excellent. Well, so I'm at the concluding race, so that works out. So again, takeaway point or argument from this work is that fiscal impacts may potentially have first importance or relevance for climate policy. And again, the benchmark estimates of the direct fiscal cost of climate change in the US at 2.5-degree warming are about a 1.2% increase in government consumption and a 0.3% increase in transfers. And I estimate large elasticities of the social cost of carbon with respect to both of these impact channels. So there's a lot to do in this project, and one, everything I've shown you today is point estimates. That's not very satisfactory. So I've been working on accounting for forecast uncertainties and doing extensive Monte Carlo sensitivity analysis. I've also been working on looking at the climate beta in this setting. So by climate beta, I mean the normalized covariance between the return to emissions reductions and consumption, right? So we know the climate beta is very important for conceptually the appropriate discounting of climate change. And it's often estimated to be around 1, calling for a relatively high discount rate on climate damages. But I would suspect in this setting, it might be considerably lower because fiscal impacts they act more like additive effects than like multiplicative damages. So that's something I've been looking at. And I also have data on inland flooding that I'm excited to dig into to look at what their fiscal effects may or may not be. And I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lint. That was a very good, very interesting presentation. I have Armon Rezai who raised his hand, and I just unmuted him, I presume. And Armon, can you
Hi,
come in?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, hi, Lint. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one is about the point that Rick raised about the time consistency issue. Have you thought about re-optimizing after a couple of decades? You could fix the optimal solution for the first 5 decades and then re-optimize from there. But that would give you a quantitative check on how big that re-optimization would be. And I expect it would be small. So that would be a good answer to have. And the second thing is, I know Rick also has, I guess I'm just echoing Rick here, but distribution would be interesting because, especially if you look at something like the United States, there's a lot of literature showing how climate impacts are different according to, also vary with income. So if you have a planner who's concerned about distribution and you see that the poor households are hit harder by the impacts of climate change, then that would also change the marginal cost of public funds in a way. And I know you can't go fully distributional, but maybe there's a very crude way maybe two agents that you include, one rich, one poor?
Thank you so much for both of these suggestions. I love the idea of the re-optimization. That's a great suggestion. Thank you. And then the redistribution, I agree. It's relevant both sort of empirically, quantitatively, and also theoretically for several reasons. There's one point that Rick has raised in the past, which is there's also a question. There's an argument that's been put forth by Lewis Koplow that tax distortions are less relevant for environmental policy in a setting where you have nonlinear income taxes and you can adjust them to undo some of the general equilibrium effects of environmental taxes. But we don't know to what extent that would translate to a dynamic setting. So I think there's a lot of questions that could be very, very interesting with on the distributional front. So thank you for both suggestions.
Thomas?
Yeah, thanks. I have a very general question, maybe an outsider question. So apologies for my ignorance. But what surprises me, we have heard a lot of talks about optimal carbon taxes, and the optimality criteria has always been GDP. And the damage functions can be debated apparently and have some uncertainty. And what I was always like waiting for in a way was to account for the decision by policy to have the 2-degree target, and to simply calculate what carbon tax is necessary to get there. But instead, we have seen many talks basically allowing much higher climate change with uncertain damages. So why is nobody, looking at this simple question like, okay, here's the target, 2-degree. What does it take to get there in terms of carbon tax? Is it too simple or boring, or I guess it's published and I've not read the paper. Yeah.
Yes, there are a lot of scholars who investigate that question, and not just the 2-degree target, but also there's a literature on carbon budgets and climate policy design when we're thinking about a carbon budgets rather than optimize sort of a standard optimal problem or a fixed temperature target. So there is work. I think Rick also has done some work on this. So there's references that I'd be happy to follow up with you on that.
So just what's a rough number? Like $100 per ton, 200? What's necessary?
It depends on the model that you use.
Okay.
I think there's quite a spread, and I think actually Dietz et al. In their 2020 paper have a graph that shows you a range of what the I don't know, remember if it's a 2-degree target, but what these prices look like. So there's I'd be happy to follow up with you on that.
Thomas, I mean, your characterization of expressing this just in terms of minimizing GDP losses is close, but not quite right. I mean, there is a welfare function that is being maximized here, which has a lot of problems and is very, is missing an enormous amount, especially in terms of inequality. But it's not just GDP. It's more like something akin to utility or happiness, although with enormous limitations. Lint, I wanted to give you a reaction that is probably going to sound like I'm just repeating what I said to Tony earlier. If I think about the fiscal costs of climate change for a country like the US, for me, it's very hard to see something that abstracts from immigration. Whether it's the cost, because I mean, I start from the premise that climate change will create migration flows that are unprecedented, just absolutely gigantic. And then a country like the US will either have to spend a huge amount of money to accommodate the people coming in, whether it's housing or schooling or hospitals or quelling civil unrest, or enormous amount of money spent at the border to repel these gigantic waves of people trying to come in, or gigantic amount of money spent to subsidize people to stay where they are. But when one way or the other, climate change will cost a gigantic amount of money to deal with this incipient migration. So for me, you had a next step bullet point in the last slide. For me, that would be way, high on my list.
Thank you for that suggestion, first of all. Yes, I think it's hard to disagree with the fact that the migration issue also, another thing I'm not accounting for is internal migration in the US, right? I'm implicitly holding the population distribution in the United States constant, but that's unlikely to be true with climate change. So that's another migration margin that I'm not currently accounting for. I agree, those are very important. But challenging, right? Because I would then also have to account for the macroeconomic effects of having more migrants, right? To the extent that it's stimulating or revenue raising, that's also a margin that would have to be accounted for, but certainly something important to think about. Thank you.
And then, if I may add, there is also the fact that the geopolitical instability around the world will probably require massive amount, for the US that is so unless the US shuts down completely and disengages with the rest of the world, dealing with the crisis, geopolitical crisis all over the world because of climate change will also be incredibly expensive.
May I just shortly, directly on the migration issue, because it has been raised a few times. A lot has been published about this, and the uncertainties are enormous, and the projections are very, very different. However, many people seem to believe that most of the displacement will indeed be within one country, and most people will not make it to rich areas like Europe or the US. They get stuck before. They simply don't have the means. And also with the conflict in Syria, most refugees never made it to Europe. So yeah, this seems to be the common thinking, that maybe this massive flow of people to countries like the US or Europe, from what I have seen, most people think that it's maybe going to be less massive than we think, but it's nevertheless still a big problem. Being displaced by climate change is not, can be quite terrible.
I think the question is, that's because rich countries spend a lot of money to stop them from arriving.
It's one of the reasons, but I think it's a complex issue.
Larry, yeah.
So Lynn, I found a very interesting paper. Congratulations. So one question I have is, if you do business as usual, no policy, how big is the increment increase to the cost of carbon, the damages? Are we talking about like a 20% increase in damages measured?
Approximately. I've done it on I haven't done it on the business as usual path, but I would venture to guess the order of magnitude would be around 20%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it'd be interesting to know how much of this is the having to raise taxes and the excess burden from additional from distorting labor supply, and maybe intertemporal if you're changing income taxes as well. Well, you did that a little bit, but already. So, but if you had progressive taxes, if you had a heterogeneity, the excess burden increase would be bigger. Then one other quick comment about time and consistency. It seems like with these infinitely lived agents, they should be able to overcome time and consistency, because the same set of people are running, with the same preferences, are voting for the government through time. So all these dynasties are, it's not like they really constitute the government, and they're not changing through time because they have the same preferences. So you would think they would find a way to overcome any time and consistency problem, lock themselves in to this kind of to behavior that wouldn't be time inconsistent. But anyway, minor point.
I mean, the reputation argument is one that is made for assuming commitment, but yeah, I think that, as you've pointed out, there's bigger questions about the general intertemporal optimization setup to begin with.
Okay, there is, I just report there is one last comment in the chat, which I think is the answer to Thomas' question. On carbon taxes, energy models that target net zero emissions by 2050 find much higher carbon taxes are needed, starting at 100, 150, rising much higher by 2050 in order to reach and stay at net zero. So that's, I guess, one answer to your question, Thomas, before.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lint. That was a great paper. Actually, both papers in this session were really stimulating and interesting. So I'm very happy with that. Thank you very much, both of you.